If you want to keep the euro in the long term, or if it should be maybe slowly.
Okay, it's the same question.
Yeah, same.
Okay, let me be brief. What Schäuble wants, and I know that because he's written about it, we've discussed it, is a semblance of federation, where the Eurogroup becomes, he doesn't feel good that it's not legal. He wants to legalize it. And he wants to turn the president of the Eurogroup into the fiscal leviathan of the Eurozone. He doesn't call him that, but he wants him to be, if you want, the fiscal representative of, or treasurer, the treasurer of the Eurozone. But he wants to give this person a tiny little budget, tiny federal budget, 1% of GDP, nothing in other words. And the main function for this person will be to have a veto power over national budgets. Mm-hmm. Now, this is a monstrous notion. Let me give you an example. On the one hand, you have a parliament, the French National Assembly, voting in a budget. Okay? The budget of the French government is 50% of GDP. Half of the economy of France is controlled by the state. Okay? And now you're going to have a fiscal overlord in Europe that has a 1% budget. In other words, has absolutely no capacity to affect surplus recycling within Europe and stabilize European capitalism. But he is going to have, I was going to say he or she, but we know it's going to be a he, don't we? He is going to have the right to veto the budget that the National Assembly of France voted. And why? In order to keep countries within the fiscal constraints of the Maastricht Treaty, which has so abundantly and spectacularly failed. And let me give you an example of why this is just mad. And it makes absolutely no sense, even from a neoliberal perspective. Take Ireland. Ireland, before 2008, was the blue-eyed boy or girl of the international neoliberal Washington consensus. They had turned their markets so elastic that they, they resembled a circus. They had a debt to GDP ratio of 25%. Half that of Germany. They were never above budget. They had a surplus. Actually, they had a surplus. So they were the model country, the model citizen of the neoliberal mantra. Okay? Now, of course, if you look at what was happening in the private sector, they had gone crazy with, there was a frenzy of indebtedness, like here in Wall Street and so on and so forth. The moment the credit crunch began after Lehman Brothers, the developers went bust. The developers' loans to the Anglo-Irish Bank and the various other shady banks in Ireland went bad.
Wanking fucking bankers.
They became non-performing. Those banks immediately became insolvent. And then the president of the central bank, a certain Mr. Jean-Claude Trichet, called the Irish prime minister and said, transfer all the losses of the private sector onto the public books, onto the taxpayers, or else, or I will close down your banks. Remember that happened to me a few years later too. Huh? And at that point, suddenly, Irish public debt went from 25% to 120%.
Fuck's sake, man, this is a joke.
Now, what would the fiscal overlord do then? Nothing. Would he veto this? No, because it was the central bank's directive that pushed all the losses of the private sector onto the taxpayers. So this system that Dr. Schäuble is proposing is just an attempt to legitimize the illegitimate current informal system. It has absolutely no capacity to stabilize European capitalism. The only thing it will do, it will formalize the current impasse. You're asking me what I want. I would like a federal democracy. I would like a European Parliament. I would like a federal government with a substantial budget, with proper surplus recycling. And I would like to have a European Union constitution that is 15, 20 pages and not written by a failed former president of France that scripts the preface that happened in 2005, beginning with the rights of capital. You knew that, didn't you? That there was an attempt to write the European Union Constitution, which began the preface, the Bill of Rights, was all about the rights of capital. This is you can't make it up, can you?
Take a country like Ireland and a country like Greece. Ireland is certainly a better run country than Greece in terms of its bureaucracy, corruption, and so on. And if you look at public debt, the public debt in Ireland was much less than Germany's before the crisis, whereas Greece's was already very high. But is there a fundamental difference really between Ireland and Greece in terms of the dynamic that I'm discussing here? Not really. Think of what was happening up until 2008, 2009 in Ireland. Deutsche Bank, Finanzbank were lending to the Anglo-Irish Bank and to other such rather idiotic banks in Ireland. They were lending to the developers. The developers had a very cozy relationship with the government that allowed them rezoning of permissions for building new white elephants of blocks of flats and blocks of offices. A bubble was created in Ireland. Then it blew up. Under the threat from the European Central Bank, the Irish government took all these losses away from the private sector and dumped them on the public's books. In Greece, was it that different? During the good times, it was the Greek state that was borrowing money from Deutsche Bank, giving it to the developers who were building those highways and motorways and autobahns that cost 3 times what they cost here in Germany. And then when the whole thing broke down, the Greek public debt was unsustainable. Huh? There is an unstoppable dynamic there that goes beyond human frailties and bad choices.
I tend to see kind of an asymmetric risk here, and I feel like that's the way the talks have been structured the way they are. On the one hand, if the EU doesn't get what it wants, if the 27 nations don't get a 60 billion euro settlement, it really doesn't matter to the day-to-day business in Brussels. If Britain, on the other hand, doesn't get a trade deal, it makes a huge difference to the UK. I mean, why would the EU structure the talks in any other way, since it really doesn't matter as much to the EU, nearly as much as it does to the UK, how these negotiations go?
Well, this is a pertinent question, which leads to the secondary question. So why has London accepted a negotiation that will never yield an outcome for Britain which is consistent with the promises that the London government has made to the people of Britain? My position has always been that this post-Article 50 triggering negotiation was always designed by Brussels to fail. It was an attempt to humiliate effectively the British government, to take it through its paces the way it is doing, and then lead to a lopsided agreement, an agreement that favors, let's say, Italian winemakers and German automobile manufacturers and not British services. So my proposal has always been, my recommendation to the London government is, sever these negotiations and instead file an application for a European Economic Area agreement for a period of 5 years, let's say, after the 2-year Article 50 process is over, because they will not be able to deny you this. It solves all the short-term, medium-term problems of financing, of the Irish border, of EU citizen rights, and it also properly restores sovereignty to the House of Commons, because you give them 5 or 6 years from today to debate amongst themselves what kind of arrangements they want to see between the European Union and the United Kingdom. So I agree entirely with your point.
Hang on. I mean, that's an interesting suggestion from a professor of economics. It makes sense, but the Irish border issue is more than just about economics, right? I mean, part of the Brexit vote was that a lot of people in Britain want to control their borders, and that would mean a closed border would have to mean a closed border between Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland. How is that issue going to be solved without hurting the cause for peace in Ireland?
Well, the trick is to combine the economics with the politics. I agree entirely with you. This is not a theoretical exercise. People's lives in Northern Ireland, in Ireland generally, depend on maintaining the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, on maintaining the absence of the border. But I must remind you that it was Mr. Boris Johnson who, before the referendum in June 2016, unequivocally promised that there would be no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. Indeed, most Brexiteers have actually made that promise, and they still do to a large extent. But this is not a promise which is consistent with a hard Brexit. You cannot simultaneously propose to keep the border and do away with it. So the proposal that I'm putting forward is a practical proposal, one that combines economics and politics, one that allows the Good Friday Agreement to be maintained. Because if Britain remains for 5-6 years in the European Economic Area, it remains in the single market, the border issue goes away, and primarily, from a political perspective and a practical perspective, Angela Merkel will breathe a sigh of relief, because it will mean the long-term Brexit situation is going to be, a hot potato that ends in the lap of the next Chancellor, and therefore you have a period of calm, of peace, of genuine discussions between Theresa May and Angela Merkel, and the House of Commons gets to deliberate on what needs to be done while Ireland remains peaceful.
Paddy?
Paddy Agnew, Sunday Independent. Professor, to change theme slightly, Brexit, you say Salvini's working towards the disintegration of the European Union, or that's his aim. But have Mr. Farage and Boris Johnson started the job already? And do you feel that we're in a Brexit situation where the 27 countries say, unless we get an Irish border resolution, there'll be no deal? Do you think the 27 countries will hold together on that?
Yes. But then the question is, will London prefer no deal to a united Ireland? Because that is the issue, really. I do believe that, and remember that DiEM25 is a movement with a presence in Ireland, both the Republic and Northern Ireland, and we're very proud of that. And we've brought people together that they would not have been in the same movement if DiEM was not in Ireland. We think that this is a magnificent opportunity to bring back the concept of, in a non-sectarian way, of a united Ireland. The border must never return. The Good Friday Agreement must be maintained and supported. And Europe has a role to play in this. But let me say something about Brexit. You mentioned Mr. Johnson and Mr. Farage. They would never have succeeded to win the Brexit referendum if it was not for the incompetence of Brussels and Frankfurt in handling the inevitable crisis of the Eurozone between 2010 and 2016. And let me explain this. At a time when the financial world was collapsing between 2008 and 2010, the European Central Bank, completely hostage of its charter that was written by the Bundesbank, was shrinking the money supply, while the Bank of England was boosting the money supply as if there is no tomorrow. The Bank of Japan, the Fed in the United States. The result was hundreds of thousands of Italians, Greeks, Spaniards, Portuguese moving to England at a time when Mr. Osborne, the Tory party treasurer, was imposing austerity on the majority of the English people. So you have the refloating of the financial markets in England, drawing people from the continent, while British workers were being treated with austerity. That was a recipe for creating the Brexit movement. It was Brussels and Frankfurt's policies that gave rise to the disintegration of the European Union with Brexit. This is why DiEM25 is determined to clash with the Brussels establishment in order to save the European Union, in order to make sure that borders like the one between the Republic and Northern Ireland never come back.
Buongiorno.